Hello. This is an in-depth discussion on polyunsaturated fatty acids, and in particular omega-3 fatty acids. This video assumes that you have basic knowledge of enzymes, atoms, and molecules. This video is for all people of all different types of diets. I've read over probably 100 different scientific papers regarding the subject, and so this is just a summary of the sort of basic information and important information. There'll be other videos to follow that go into more depth. So first, when talking about polyunsaturated fatty acids, one needs to know what a fatty acid is. And essentially the basic structure of these molecules are that they are carbon atoms bonded together in a chain with hydrogen atoms on the side. So when one is talking about saturated versus unsaturated in regard to fatty acids, one's actually talking about the number of hydrogen atoms. Given a number of carbon atoms, there are a maximum number of hydrogen atoms. And if a fat has that maximum number, this is regarded as saturated because it's saturated with hydrogen. If a fat is saturated with hydrogen, then all bonds between the carbon atoms are single bonds, which means that they will be rigid and straight. And so a saturated fat, will be a straight, rigid structure. If one of these bonds becomes unsaturated by taking hydrogen away, then it will form a double bond, and this is a bendy structure, which I think is able to twist perhaps, and means that the fatty acid is no longer straight and rigid. With one of these unsaturated bonds, bendy bonds, this is called monounsaturated, mono meaning one, and if there are multiple, then it's called polyunsaturated, which means many. And so this video is about fatty acids that have many kinky bonds, essentially. The number of unsaturated bonds determines many different chemical properties, particularly the melting temperature of these materials. For saturated bonds, or for saturated fats, because they are a long chain, if you have many of them together, it takes a lot of energy to split them apart because of the chemical properties, and so they have a high melting temperature. Examples of this are coconut oil, palm oil, and butter. And so these at room temperature will be solid. Examples of unsaturated fatty acids, or unsaturated oils, are olive oil, flax oil, and just vegetable oil in general. And these are liquids at room temperature. However, if one takes the process of hydrogenation, one is adding hydrogen to these fats and saturating their bonds. And so one can actually take a vegetable oil that was originally liquid at room temperature, add hydrogen atoms to it, the bonds become saturated, and then it is now a solid at room temperature. And this is how you get margarine made from vegetables and other things. And so things like partially hydrogenated oils are done so because it produces a different texture that is more solid and also can last longer in storage. Because of these different melting temperatures, different plants and animals in different climates have different ratios of unsaturated to saturated. In warm climates, where these oils are heated, the plants can actually have more saturated fats because they're not so rigid. But in cold climates, plants and animals must have more unsaturated fats, or else they would be too rigid to function properly. So in warm climates, you have coconut oil, palm oil, and those are two good examples. But in colder climates, you have things like borage, and other examples, doesn't really matter. Say for fish, however, the colder the climate is, the more unsaturated the fats are. And so that's why if you're trying to get unsaturated or polyunsaturated fats from your fish, they suggest cold water fish. So, regarding unsaturated fatty acids, and in particular polyunsaturated fatty acids, there are two main categories that are important to science right now. There are different categories, but there haven't been too much research, and there isn't too much to say about them yet. These two categories are the omega-3s and the omega-6s. The reasoning behind the name is that they refer to the location of the first double bond in the carbon chain. Omega-3 has their first bond 3 carbon atoms from the end of the chain, whereas omega-6 has its first bond 6 carbon atoms from the end. Omega, meaning end in Greek, or symbolizing it at least, is the reasoning behind that word. These different categories, because the bonds are in different locations, these fats can be very similar, but they are different. Plants and animals aren't really able to convert between the two. And so if you have an omega-3, you can do lots of things to it, but it's usually going to end up as an omega-3. And if you have an omega-6, the same thing. So these fats can be long chain or short chain, and that refers to the number of carbon atoms in the chain. Short chains are from plants. These are the only organisms which are able to create the initial bonds, the initial omega-3 or omega-6 bond, so close to the end. Animals don't have the proper enzymes to perform this process. And this means that animals must actually get these fats from outside sources. Plants are able to take CO2 and glucose and turn that into fat and then create these bonds. But humans and other animals are not able to. This is why they're deemed essential fatty acids, because they are essential to the diet. If you do not eat any omega-6s or omega-3s, you do not have any in your body, aside from what you had when you were born, and that slowly diminishes. So these short chains are usually found in plants, and plants usually don't make them very long because they apparently don't need them. However, animals do need long-chain fatty acids. They're very important for many different reasons. And if you don't have them, you'll have certain diseases. So, take a group of animals like herbivores. They cannot create these fats from scratch, so they must eat them or get them from plants. So, herbivores get the short chains from the plants, and then have a long process of involving different enzymes taking that short chain, making it longer to get to the long chain fatty acids. Animals like omnivores or carnivores are able to actually skip the whole process of eating plants and eat an animal that has already eaten a plant. So an herbivore eats the plant, gets a short chain, makes it long chain, and then a carnivore eats that animal and so gets the long chain. It doesn't have to create it from scratch. True carnivores, like cats, that only eat animals, in the wild at least, actually cannot convert the short chain fats, or at least most of them, and cannot do it whatsoever. And so they must actually get long chain fatty acids from their diet, and they're not able to be vegetarian or vegan particularly. And this is beneficial actually to the cat, because if it's only eating animals, it doesn't need to waste energy maintaining this process. And so one cat way back when lost the ability to perform this process, and it actually had an advantage because it had more energy to use for other things. So these omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, as I said before, are highly related. They're very similar in structure, but the difference is where the first carbon bond is. However, they both utilize the same elongation process. So if one eats a short chain fatty acid omega-3 or an omega-6, they both use the same enzymes along the same process to create the long chain, because they're so chemically similar. This process, I believe at least one point in the process, and it's sort of the bottleneck of the process, involves a certain enzyme called delta-6 desaturase. This enzyme actually prefers omega-3s. So if there are, say, 50% omega-3s and 50% omega-6s, it'll actually use up more of the omega-3s. However, in nature, usually there are more omega-6s than omega-3s. And so this means that you can have more omega-6s than omega-3s and still produce the same long chain. So you have different ratios of the short chain, more omega-6s, but you still have the same ratio of the long chain at the end of the process, because it prefers processing omega-3s. And this is somewhat interesting, that these mechanisms actually prefer omega-3s, and you can draw various conclusions from that. Eating these short chain polyunsaturated fatty acids turns on this process, or increases it at least. Animals are able to recognize that these chains or these fats are ingested, and then turns on the process or increases it to get it going, which is beneficial because when you're not eating these, then your body can save energy by not using this process. But it is always still on, because you probably always still have a small number of these short chains in various parts of your body. As a feedback mechanism, however, long chain fatty acids turn down the process or slow it down. So once the body recognizes that it has enough long chain, it can then shut down the process, and it says it does not need to convert any more short chain. So, because this process prefers omega-3s, different scientific studies or results from these studies have suggested that one should try to attain to a ratio of 4 parts omega-6 to 1 part omega-3. This ensures that enough omega-3s are processed. Say if you only had 1 part omega-3 to 10 parts omega-6, because the process uses the same enzymes, all the enzymes might be taken up by the omega-6s, and the omega-3s are just sort of floating around and not being used, and not being elongated to the long parts that you need. So, because of these reasons and the feedback mechanisms, let's take an example where someone's eating long-chain omega-6s and short-chain omega-3s. This could be the case where someone's eating corn-fed beef just as part of their diet, which is predominantly omega-6s and long-chain because it's from an animal, and they see that they need to increase their omega-3 intake. They might believe that it would be beneficial to then eat flaxseed or hemp seed or chia or walnuts, which are high in omega-3s, but these are plant sources. So, because they're eating corn-fed beef with high levels of omega-6 long-chain fatty acids and low levels of omega-3s, the body recognizes the omega-6 long chains and says, we have enough long chains, let's shut down the process of transformation. So when the person is ingesting the short chain omega-3s, the process is very slow and there's a low conversion rate, and so they're essentially wasting the short chain omega-3s from the nuts and seeds, and they're not being utilized. This is because the feedback mechanism doesn't recognize the difference between omega-3s and omega-6s. All it recognizes is that there are long chains. And so one needs to be aware of this. The reason that there's no difference, or that the body doesn't recognize the difference, is because in nature, omega-3s and omega-6s are usually already at a particular ratio. And so if you're eating omega-6s, it's pretty much guaranteed that you're going to get omega-3s. However, in modern society, where we have domesticated animals eating unnatural diets, this ratio can be thrown off. Take cows. Their natural diet is, among other things, different types of grass. Grass has more omega-3s than corn, but we feed corn to the cows because it's cheaper. So the cows that are produced in corn farms or whatever are going to have much higher levels of omega-6 than omega-3. This is a reason that grass-fed beef is healthier, because you're getting the omega-6s, or the omega-3s, but there are other reasons that it's not perfect. So if you're eating omega-6s from animals and trying to get omega-3s from plants, it's not going to work. Alright, so now we should get into the different types of the long-chain fatty acids. There are 3 in particular that are very bioactive and play large roles, at least in the human organism. So along the line of shorter to longer, these are at the long end. And these are used in the complex processes, such as inflammation, brain chemistry, nerves, and reproduction. So these are known by acronyms, usually, and also by longer names. They're EPA, DHA, and AA. EPA and DHA are omega-3s, and AA are omega-6s. EPA stands for eicosapentaenoic acid, and DHA stands for docosahexaenoic acid. These two names represent the chemical structure and the number of bonds and the number of carbon atoms. AA, the omega-6, stands for arachidonic acid or arachidonic acid. EPA and AA are the same length, essentially. I believe they have 20 carbon atoms. And so they are very similar in structure, and they're used in many different ways. An enzyme that EPA fits into, AA probably also fits into, because they're so similar. The difference is where the first double bond is. DHA, well, to be clear, EPA is omega-3 and AA is omega-6. DHA is the other omega-3, and it is produced from EPA. So, an animal eating the short-chain fatty acids uses the elongation process, and so it makes them longer and longer. In this process, you get EPA, and then that gets turned into DHA, which is sort of one of the end products. And because this process is sort of a straight line and doesn't really reverse very much, although it can, but it probably doesn't, it's important to note that DHA is created from EPA, but EPA is not created from DHA. So, often when one is trying to get enough omega-3s, they will take supplements of EPA and DHA. Many studies have shown that ingesting DHA, at least in the short term, is associated with positive benefits. However, by only having DHA, you're not getting any EPA. And so if you're eating a animal-based diet with lots of long chains, you're shutting down the whole process, or at least slowing it down. And then only eating DHA, you're not getting any EPA because there's no way to produce it and you're not getting it from any source. So, there are lots of supplements that suggest, or that are DHA, I think from algae sources, but this is not supported by science, really. If you're going to supplement DHA, you really want to supplement EPA. Now, EPA and AA, or arachidonic acid, these are the two that are very similar, and they act on lots of the same enzymes. One enzyme in particular is called COX-2, or COX-2. And this is involved in inflammation. When a signal comes to a cell that indicates that there has been cellular damage, like the cellular membrane has been destroyed, the COX-2 enzyme is produced. This enzyme takes EPA and AA, changes them, and creates two different compounds. Takes the omega-3 EPA and makes an anti-inflammatory compound, but it takes the omega-6 AA and creates an inflammatory compound. So the same enzyme, if you give it an omega-3, it's good, and if you give it an omega-6, that's bad. In a symbolic way. Inflammation is good in the sense that it stops bleeding. It can halt the travel of pathogens. So if you have an infection in a certain area, then inflammation in that area keeps it there, so that white blood cells can destroy the invader. Same with if you get a cut, inflammation can help stop bleeding. If you have an infection, inflammation raises your body temperature, which helps in the process of destroying the invader. But in cases of chronic inflammation, like muscle pain or different inflammatory diseases, often this can be too much and not used in the correct way or in the correct amounts. Certain drugs like NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, actually act on this COX-2 enzyme in particular and disable it. Because the human body has more omega-6s than omega-3s, or more arachidonic acid than EPA, turning off the enzyme entirely actually reduces inflammation. However, this should only be used in like emergency cases and rarely. It's not a long-term solution. If one has long-term inflammatory problems, one should actually increase their EPA, the EPA in their body, so that instead of disabling the enzyme, you use it to your benefit to create anti-inflammatory compounds from the EPA to counteract the AA, or the compounds from AA. And furthermore, because the same enzyme works on EPA and AA, the more EPA you have, the more of the COX-2 enzymes that are being used up, and the less enzymes that are available to the AA. So it works in a multiplicative way. So EPA is very important for reducing inflammation. Reducing inflammation that you don't want, like chronic inflammation. And so that's why supplementing only DHA is not suggested. Because without any EPA, then COX-2 is able to work on AA without much competition. I think COX-2 also works on DHA, but yeah. So we should also go over the fact that the more unsaturated a fatty acid is, or in this context, the longer it is, the more unstable it is. So, as I said earlier, if a fatty acid is saturated, that means there's more hydrogen atoms. And because of that, the bond between consecutive carbon atoms is what's known as a single bond, and that it's a rigid bond. If a bond is unsaturated, then it's a double bond, and it's like a kink. The nature of the chemistry is that these double bonds are much more unstable and susceptible to being broken apart. And so things like EPA, DHA, and AA are very susceptible to being destroyed by free radicals, which are simply molecules that are unstable themselves and want to rip things off or just wreak havoc. So, one should know that polyunsaturated fatty acids are very susceptible to being destroyed by free radicals or oxidants. However, the natural counterbalance to free radicals are antioxidants. These neutralize essentially the free radicals in a way and prevent them from destroying the long chain fatty acids. These are particularly like vitamins, but there are also other antioxidants, of course. Because of this, DHA, which is produced from EPA and is slightly longer, is actually more unstable. Because of this, DHA doesn't really travel in your blood very much, or at least the body doesn't prefer that. It prefers to produce EPA from the short chains. So in the process, it takes a short chain, makes it a little longer to the EPA, and then sends it off into the blood to go to certain parts of the body. Then when it reaches the location where DHA is needed, the DHA is created on site and then stays there, essentially. And so the DHA is now in this location, but it did not have to travel through the bloodstream in its unstable form. EPA did that instead. And so the body is smart like this. There is a vitamin called vitamin E, and there's many different varieties of this, but I think at least one of them increases the conversion rate from EPA to DHA. And so this is an interesting mechanism whereby the conversion from EPA to DHA is done more in the presence of this vitamin E, which is an antioxidant. The interesting part there is that the DHA is produced more when it's apparent that there are less free radicals, because DHA is so susceptible to oxidation. And so this is a mechanism of the body which is somewhat important. One should realize that ingesting EPA and DHA and also AA, which are the three long-chain fatty acids that I mentioned earlier, one should do this with other antioxidants and with as little free radicals as possible. For instance, when one's ingesting fish, if that fish is contaminated with something like mercury, or just a random free radical from the process of bioaccumulation, which you could look up, these fats that you're ingesting that you think are helping you reduce inflammation are actually being destroyed before they get to where they need to be, and so it can be a counterproductive process. So it would make sense to eat meat and vegetables together. It does not make sense to eat meat separately, especially if it's burnt meat, because that is a lot of free radicals. So if you cook your fish, better to have it raw, actually, like sushi. And also with lots of greens. Finally, we should talk about an interesting coincidence, at least, and that's regarding sesame seeds. There is a protein in sesame seeds which inhibits the bottleneck process in the elongation chain. And so if this protein is in your blood, it will actually slow down your conversion from short chain to long chain fatty acids. Usually you'd assume that proteins are broken down before they get to your blood. However, this is not always the case. If you have something like leaky gut syndrome, or you just have bad digestion where you're not able to actually digest the food you're eating, or you're not chewing it or whatever, this could somehow get into your blood and slow the process down. So, if you are eating nuts and seeds with omega-3s to get them that way, it would actually make sense not to mix it with sesame seeds, because that could be counterproductive. This includes hummus, because hummus has sesame seeds in the form of tahini, which is like sesame seed paste. So if you're eating walnuts, don't eat them with hummus. However, this bottleneck enzyme, which is inhibited or stopped by the protein in sesame seeds, is involved in two different parts in the elongation process. It's involved in getting the very first process, and this enzyme is called delta-6 desaturase, by the way. It's involved in the very first process, which starts the cascade, and so it's the bottleneck of the process as well, because if that's shut down, the whole thing's shut down. But it's also involved in converting EPA to DHA. So, if you're eating sesame seeds with EPA, you are actually perhaps limiting the conversion of EPA to DHA, which could be beneficial. You'd assume that this protein would not get into your brain or any location that is in the periphery of your body simply by random chance. But also the blood-brain barrier would probably block it. And so you can prevent the conversion to DHA except in the locations where DHA is needed more. And so this could be a reason why sesame seeds evolved to have this protein. Animals that ate this protein were conferred a certain evolutionary benefit because of the relative stability of EPA. But that's just a hypothesis. So that's something to keep in mind. Or that's just something that the science suggests, at least. That's interesting. So that pretty much wraps up the science behind it. I'll go more into depth in a different video, with more things in particular, but this is focusing more on diet and describing the elongation process. So I'll just talk about now foods which contain these two different omega-3s and omega-6s. And once again, you should consider having a ratio of 4 omega-6s to 1 omega-3, but only when you're considering the short chain fatty acids, because it's the elongation process that prefers omega-3s, and so you're able to eat more omega-6s without having to worry about that. However, when you're getting the long chain fatty acids, the process is completely skipped, and so I don't think it's as important, although you still do need omega-3s. The body regulates it in different ways, I think. So, in regard to plants, popular sources of omega-3s are walnuts, hemp seed, chia seed, and flaxseed. Walnuts can be eaten regular, hemp seed can be eaten regular, but chia seed and flax are a little more difficult. Flaxseed you need to grind up because usually if you're eating it without chewing it an extreme amount, you're not actually breaking the shell apart, and so you're not really going to digest it much. Chia seeds, on the other hand, you don't even need to chew, which is weird, but whatever. But chia seeds and flax seeds are very dehydrating. They suck up a lot of water. So if you have a regular meal and you add a ton of chia seeds to it, you're going to be really dehydrated and like it's going to dry up real fast. So it's suggested that you actually make chia pudding, which is you just add water to chia seeds and you keep stirring it until it turns into like a gel, like frog eggs or whatever. It doesn't taste bad or anything, trust me. And then you eat it that way. If you just put chia seeds on top of your salad, you're just going to get dehydrated. And you probably don't want to drink water with it separately. It's just easier to make the pudding. And so with flaxseed, you should also be aware of that. That if you add too much flaxseed to your meal, it could dry it up. So that's the omega-3s. And yes, it is strange that there's not very many foods with lots of omega-3s. Walnuts have, I think, a 3-to-1 ratio of 6-to-3, so that's very good. But hemp seed, I think, is better, or around the same. And then flaxseed is even better. It's like 2-to-1 of omega-3 to omega-6, which is really good. And then chia seed is even higher, like 5-to-1 of 3-to-6 or something. So chia seed is actually the best. But flaxseed has tons of antioxidants, so you can't really go wrong. Nuts and seeds all have antioxidants. But flax, yeah. So omega-6s, well, omega-3s now in the long chain, these are from usually fish, cold water fish, and in particular also algae. I'm not really sure what the ratios are on algae, but you can get long chain fatty acids from that, and it's, I guess, a vegan source, if that's what you're into. But you should be aware of contamination of algae, which can negatively affect the usability of those long chain fatty acids that are susceptible to oxidation. And also probably grass-fed animals and more naturally animals from the wild, they probably have a much higher omega-3 to 6 ratio, although it's probably not high enough for humans to eat. Omega-6s, however, are pretty much everything else. In particular, avocados are very high in omega-6. They're 10-to-1 ratio, or around there. Lots of people say, hey, there's lots of omega-3s in avocados, and that's true, but it's not the nominal amount, it's the ratio that you want. And so if you're, say, like a raw vegan who eats avocados for dinner or something, and thinks that that's your way of getting fat, that's a really bad idea, because if you're not getting any long chain fatty acids and you're getting only short chain omega-6s, the entire process is clogged up by the omega-6 fats, and so the omega-3s aren't being processed at a high rate at all. So avocados should be eaten with chia seeds or flax or hemp or walnuts, optimally. It doesn't really matter the rare avocado here or there, but if you're eating only avocado as your only fat source, then just because there are omega-3s in it doesn't mean you're getting any of them and processing them into long chain. So other Nuts and seeds are predominantly omega-6, like almonds and just everything else. So you really need to be aware of that. There's lots of websites that give the ratios. I think Wolfram Alpha, you can put it in there and you see the milligrams of omega-6 and milligrams of omega-3 per food. But it's just good to be aware of that so that you're keeping your ratio proper. And again, the ratio is only relevant when eating plants. If you're eating animal products that have long chain fatty acids, like, you don't really need the short chain. You should probably, because they're being used in certain ways, but you shouldn't rely on that for the long chain because the process is mitigated. I think that's it. So if you have any questions, or if you notice I said something wrong or something like that, please comment, and I will include that in the next video or a future video, which will go more into depth and be more specific as to how these are used and things like that. Thank you.